And the father would shower with the boys. He told me they would all be in the shower together, which seems peculiar.
Pardon me? So peculiar. Are they still there? Yes. The people... Oh, no.
And I knocked on Kitty's door of their room, and Kitty was in the room, but there was no Jose, and she said that he was down in Erik's room.
Was it you telling Lyle about something that was happening?
My dad. I wanted it to stop.
Why didn't you wash it off?
I went to wash it off. She said, no, just leave it.
How old were you?
11. You just never knew what was going to happen, so you were just scared.
Because of the noises I heard coming out of the room, the fact that Kitty would not allow me to go down the hallway to find out what was going on, how I wasn't allowed to see the boys right after they came out of the bedroom.
Would it make any difference to you if he was a girl? Because if it would, it shouldn't. Because men are human, and boys are human, and men and women suffer, and boys and girls suffer, and it is no different.
This is the complex and heart-wrenching story of the Lyle and Erik Menendez, two brothers whose lives were marked by unimaginable trauma and pain. Their story, often misunderstood, revolves around years of mistreatment at the hands of their own parents, José and Kitty Menendez.
Did you consume a large quantity of lemon every week?
Every day.
What was the purpose for which you were doing it?
So that I wouldn't have to taste my dad's...
Okay.
Culminating in a decision that, while tragic, they believed was their only means of survival. On August 20th, 1989, the lives of José and Kitty Menendez came to a sudden and heartbreaking end. What shocked the world more than their own deaths was the revelation that their own sons, Lyle and Erik, were responsible. But the deeper, untold side of this story lies in the brothers' claim that they were driven to this extreme action due to years of physical and emotional abuse, allegedly at the hands of both their parents.
And she told me that she knew, that she had known all my life what my father was doing. And it was like I didn't even know who she was anymore. And I just saw Dad and Mom as the same person at that point.
Was it a cold-blooded decision, or was it an act of desperate self-defense after years of suffering? In this episode, we'll dive into the layers of the Menendez family dynamic, revealing how their once picture-perfect lives were overshadowed by hidden pain, betrayal, and tragic events of that August night. We will also explore how the brothers' actions were shaped by their traumatic upbringing, leading them to believe they had no other way out. In the summer of 1989, the Menendez family seemed to have it all. José Menendez, an immigrant who had worked his way up the corporate ladder, held executive positions at prestigious companies like RCA and Live Entertainment. His success allowed the family to enjoy a lavish lifestyle in Beverly Hills, living in a $5 million mansion, driving luxury cars, and sending their sons Lyle and Erik to elite schools. From the outside, the Menendez family appeared perfect, the epitome of the American dream.
José Menendez was an entertainment executive making millions of dollars a year. Erik and Lyle were nationally ranked tennis players. On the outside, this was the perfect all-American family. Behind the gates of that mansion, it was a very different story.
But beneath the surface, Lyle and Erik would later reveal a much darker reality. According to their testimony, their father, José, was far from the loving and supportive parent the public perceived him to be. Instead, they alleged that he was a domineering tyrant who controlled every aspect of their lives. José demanded perfection, pushing the brothers beyond their limits academically and personally. Lyle, the eldest, struggled to meet his father's standards, experiencing academic failures and disciplinary issues at Princeton University.
My life was structured with little goals, and he would say that we need to set short-term goals. Just in some talks with my dad, I just was like crumbling. I just couldn't get the words out. Couldn't form the sentences.
Which led to increasing tension between the father and son. José was allegedly furious with Lyle's inability to live up to his legacy, further straining their relationship. According to Erik, José's expectations were so high that the brothers lived in constant fear of his wrath. The allegations went beyond just verbal or emotional abuse. But both brothers claimed that their father had subjected them to physical and disturbingly sex abuse from a young age. Erik testified that his father had started assaulting him when he was just 6 years old.
I mean, it was just my dad, and it was just something about it. I couldn't. When he would come into the room, I would want to say, no, I don't want to do this, and I would want to say, I don't want you to touch me, and I would want to say these things, but couldn't stop that, and I wanted to, but I couldn't. I don't know why.
A secret he kept from the outside world out of fear, shame, and intimidation. Their mother, Kitty Menendez, was described as unstable and emotionally absent, although she struggled with her own mental health issues, including depression and substance use. The brothers alleged that she also played a role in their trauma. Kitty was accused of turning a blind eye to the abuse and at times physically lashing out at her sons. According to Lee and Erik, their mother's emotional instability made it impossible for them to seek help or support from her.
My mom opened up the door and turned on the light.
And what was she doing?
She was laughing.
Did you start laughing too?
No, I was crying, and I just wanted to get out of the basement.
Mr. Menendez, do you know how old you were when you lived at that house?
I guess I was 7.
She too was said to have mistreated them physically, exacerbating their feelings of helplessness. By 1989, the tension within the family had reached an unbearable peak. José had reportedly threatened to disinherit his sons due to his disappointment in their behavior. This threat, combined with the years of mistreatment and fear, led the brothers to believe they were about to lose everything. They felt their lives emotionally and physically and financially were being torn apart by their parents' control. In their minds, they were trapped with no one to turn to and no way out.
And felt responsible because his mom was so unhappy, so clearly unhappy. She could have been an actress or a hostess in a restaurant, which seemed to have been something that she felt she missed out on.
August 20th, 1989 began like any other Sunday for the Menendez family. But for Lee and Erik, the pressure and fear they had carried for years had reached a breaking point. In their minds, they were not just planning the unthinkable act. They were planning an escape from the abuse that had shaped their lives. The brothers had purchased shotguns just days earlier under the guise of protecting the family. But the reality was far more tragic. In their testimonies, Lee and Erik said they were terrified of their father and believed that if they didn't act, their father would eventually unleash them. That night, they entered the den armed with what they described as a sense of desperate finality.
I really don't have a good memory of everything else. So many things happened to me that I don't remember. But about that night, I don't remember.
In court, the brothers' defense attorneys argued that the killings were not driven by greed or malice, but by years of trauma and fear. They testified that the boys had believed their parents were going to kill them, especially after José had allegedly discovered that Erik had confided in Lee about the ongoing abuse. According to the brothers, the events of that night were not premeditated act of violence, but rather a desperate and tragic response to years of terror. After the tragic events of August 20th, Lee and Erik were consumed by panic and fear. Their first instinct was to cover up what had happened, and in the midst of their shock, they quickly began to stage the scene as a robbery. Lee, frantic, made a 911 call that would become infamous, screaming,
I don't hear anything. I just hear Mom. Get away from me.
Okay, hey, let me talk to Erik.
My mom and my dad.
Your mom and dad?
My mom and my dad.
Okay, hold on a second. Okay, we're on our way over there with an ambulance.
Okay, I gotta go.
A reflection of the emotional and psychological torment they had lived with for years. When the police arrived, they found two brothers who appeared to be devastated by the loss of their parents. Erik was hyperventilating, collapsing onto the lawn in a ball of fear and shock. Lee, while more composed, did his best to comfort his brother, maintaining the appearance of a grieving son. To the authorities, it seemed like a tragic home invasion, and the brothers' emotional state was so convincing that the police didn't even test their hands for gunshot residue. For the time being, Lee and Erik had managed to avoid suspicion, but the emotional weight of what they had done lingered over them. The brothers' fear didn't dissipate with their parents' deaths. Instead, it was replaced by a new kind of terror. The fear of being caught and having their actions revealed to the world. Their subsequent behavior, which included a significant amount of spending and a reluctance to return to the family mansion, raised suspicions.
And I was sort of down and kind of depressed and just wandering around into stores. And we were in the jewelry store, and I don't know why, but I just purchased the Rolexes. And at some point in the purchase, I started to feel awkward about it.
But at that time, their fear-driven actions were rooted in an attempt to move on from the horrific trauma they had lived through. The emotional toll of the event proved too much for Erik Menendez to bear. He eventually confided in his close friend Craig about the killings and the years of alleged abuse they had suffered. Erik's confession wasn't one made out of arrogance or pride. It was a release from the heavy burden he had carried for so long. He needed someone to know the truth, to understand the pain and trauma that had held them to that fatal night. Craig, torn by the knowledge he now possessed, kept Erik's secret for a time, but eventually felt the weight of this information was too much for him alone. With the encouragement of law enforcement, he agreed to help gather more information about Erik's emotional state. Eventually, Erik's struggle became too great.
During the time that you spent with Erik at the hotel, could you describe what his demeanor was like?
Somber, upset, crying, basically, sad. Sad would be the tone.
Eventually, Erik's struggle became too great, and he sought out professional help from a therapist, Dr. Jerome Ozil. In a therapy session, Erik confided about the years of abuse he and his brother had endured, as well as the emotional anguish that had driven them to take their parents' lives. Dr. Ozil, recognizing the severity of this situation, recorded the sessions, evidence that would ultimately play a significant role in the investigation and trial.
Erik, you were able to tell your psychologist, but you were not able to tell your psychologist that your father had abused you?
Unless you've been molested, you can't realize how hard it is to tell.
Because of shame?
Because of shame.
As the investigation unfolded and details of the Menendez brothers' story came to light, public opinion was sharply divided. Many saw Lee and Erik as cold, calculating murderers motivated by greed and desire to inherit their parents' vast fortune. But the brothers' defense team painted a far different picture. One of two young men driven to the aid by their years of emotional and physical abuse. Testimonies from experts and witnesses detailed the horrific allegations of mistreatment, shifting the narrative from one of cold-blooded murder to one of desperate survival.
And these are the cousins who tell you that when José Menendez walks into the bedroom with either of his sons, no one else is allowed to even go down the hallway. No one listens at the door, no one goes in, no one sees what he does.
The defense argued that the brothers had genuinely believed their lives were in danger and that the tragic deaths of their parents were a form of self-defense, an act born out of fear, not malice. While the legal system eventually convicted the brothers, sentencing them to life in prison, the moral question whether they were victims or perpetrators remains debated to this day. The story of the Menendez brothers is not one of black and white. It's a story of survival in the face of alleged unimaginable trauma. While their actions cannot be fully justified, they can be better understood within the context of their experiences. Lee and Erik believed they were trapped in a life of fear, pain, and their actions, though extreme, were born out of desperate needs to escape the control of their parents.
You never saw Kitty go to see what was happening inside the room with the 2-year-old?
No.
Did you go?
No.
Did you try to go?
Yes. They were not supervising him, and he was playing around with all the rest of the cousins, which were much older, and it just scared me to see such a little one outside playing with the big ones.
And you never saw, did you ever see Kitty Menendez go out periodically to check on the baby?
This is not a story about guilt or innocence. but rather one about the complexity of human emotions and the consequences of prolonged abuse. The Menendez brothers' story serves as a sobering reminder of the lasting impact of trauma and the lengths some will go to in order to free themselves from it.